The rusted gate of Schloss Marienberg groaned open for the first time in 20 years, revealing a mansion that time had forgotten. Greta Hoffman stepped onto the overgrown gravel path, her worn boots crunching through autumn leaves, carrying nothing but a faded inheritance letter and the scars of 3 years in Soviet labor camps. Her own family had turned their backs on her when she returned from captivity, branded a traitor, a shame to the Hoffman name. Now, at 35, she was utterly alone except for this crumbling estate left by an aunt she'd never met. Behind the mansion's boarded windows lay rooms thick with dust and secrets. But it was the hidden vault beneath the library floor that would change everything. Stacks of gold bars, bearer bonds, and rare artifacts worth $265 million, a fortune that powerful men had been searching for since the war's end. Men who believed this treasure had vanished forever. Men who would do anything to claim it. The question that haunted the empty halls: why had her aunt chosen Greta to inherit this dangerous legacy? The October wind whipped through the skeletal branches overhead, sending more leaves spiraling down like ash from her memories. Greta pulled her threadbare coat tighter and studied the mansion's facade. Gothic towers stretched toward the grey sky, their stone faces weathered and streaked with decades of neglect. Ivy crawled up the walls like desperate fingers, and several shutters hung at odd angles, barely clinging to their hinges. She unfolded the letter again, though she'd memorized every word during the train journey from Berlin. The lawyer's formal script seemed absurd now. Marianne Hoffman has bequeathed her entire estate to her sole surviving niece, Greta Elizabeth Hoffman. A relative she'd never heard mentioned at family gatherings, never seen in any photograph. Even her mother had claimed ignorance when Greta called, before the line went dead and stayed that way. The front door stood slightly ajar, its red paint peeling like dried blood. Greta pushed it open with her shoulder, wincing as the hinges shrieked in protest. The sound echoed through what must have once been a grand foyer. A crystal chandelier hung crooked from the ceiling, half its bulbs shattered. Dust motes danced in the pale light filtering through grimy windows. Her footsteps echoed as she explored room after room. The dining hall still held a long mahogany table set for 12, each place setting coated in dust but perfectly arranged, as if the diners had simply vanished mid-meal. In the parlor, sheet-covered furniture crouched like ghosts. Family portraits lined the walls, their subjects' eyes seeming to track her movement through the gloom. One portrait made her stop. A woman in her 40s with steel-grey hair and Greta's own sharp cheekbones stared down from an ornate frame. The nameplate read Marianne Hoffman, 1943. 3 years before the war ended, 2 years before Greta's capture on the Eastern Front while serving as a field nurse. "Why me, Aunt Marianne?" she whispered to the painted eyes. The silence offered no answers. The library drew her next, floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with leather-bound volumes in German, French, and languages she couldn't identify. Many books lay scattered on the Persian rug, as if someone had been searching frantically through them. Greta knelt and gathered a few: philosophy texts, scientific journals, and surprisingly, several works on art history and antiquities. A loose floorboard creaked under her knee. She shifted her weight, testing it. The board moved distinctly, its edges not quite flush with its neighbors. Curious, she pried at it with her fingernails until it lifted away entirely, revealing a metal handle beneath. Her heart hammered as she pulled. A section of the floor hinged upward, exposing narrow stone steps descending into darkness. The musty smell of earth and metal rose from below. Greta found a tarnished silver candlestick on the mantelpiece and lit it with matches from her coat pocket. The flame flickered as she descended, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The steps ended at a heavy steel door marked with German text, "Authorized personnel only." The door stood open. Beyond it lay a vault that defied belief. Gold bars stacked like bricks glinted in the candlelight. Wooden crates filled with artifacts, paintings, sculptures, ornate jewelry boxes lined the walls. A desk in the center held neat piles of documents and bearer bonds marked with astronomical figures. Greta's hands shook as she lifted one of the bonds. 5 million Deutschmarks, another for 10 million Swiss francs. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Her mind reeled trying to calculate the total value. A leather journal lay open on the desk, filled with Marianne's careful handwriting. The first entry was dated April 1945. The Reich is falling. They will come for the collection soon. I must hide what I can, preserve what matters. For when someone worthy finally comes home. Footsteps creaked on the floorboards above. Greta froze, listening. Slow, deliberate steps moving through the library she'd just left. Her candle flame wavered in the suddenly still air. She wasn't alone anymore. The train's wheels clattered against the tracks, in a rhythm that matched Greta's racing heartbeat as she pressed her face to the grimy window. The Bavarian countryside rolled past in shades of amber and rust, autumn having claimed the landscape with the same ruthless efficiency she remembered from her childhood. But this wasn't a homecoming. It was a reckoning with ghosts she'd spent 5 years trying to bury. The letter crinkled in her coat pocket as she shifted. The lawyer's formal script burned into her memory. Aunt Wilhelmina was dead, and somehow, impossibly, she'd left everything to the niece her family had disowned. The niece who'd survived 3 years in Soviet camps while her brothers died, heroes' deaths on German soil. Greta's fingers unconsciously traced the thin scar along her left wrist, a memento from her first week in Siberia. The guards had thought her defiant spirit needed breaking. They'd been wrong about the breaking part, though she sometimes wondered if they'd succeeded in ways that mattered more than bone and sinew. The train lurched to a stop at Rothenburg, the ancient medieval town looking smaller and more fragile than she remembered. As Greta gathered her single battered suitcase, she caught her reflection in the window. Hollow cheeks, prematurely grey streaks threading through brown hair, eyes that had seen too much. At 28 she looked 40. At 28 she felt ancient. The station master barely glanced at her documents before waving her through. Perhaps he didn't recognize the name Hoffman anymore, or perhaps he simply didn't care about the ghosts of families that had fallen from grace. Either way, his indifference was a small mercy. The taxi driver, who agreed to take her to the Wilhelmina estate, kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror, his weather-beaten face creased with curiosity. "Haven't seen anyone go out to the old Hoffman place in years," he said, taking a sharp turn that made the car's suspension groan. "Folks say it's cursed, too many secrets buried in those walls." Greta didn't respond. She'd learned in the camps that silence was often the wisest armor, and old habits died hard. The estate appeared through a stand of birch trees like something from a fever dream. The main house, once a testament to 3 generations of Hoffman prosperity, now slumped under the weight of neglect. Ivy had claimed the eastern wall entirely, and several upper windows were boarded over with planks that had warped and darkened with age. The gardens that had once been her aunt's pride were a tangle of weeds and overgrown hedgerows. "You sure about this, miss?" the driver asked, his unease palpable. "I could take you back to town, help you find a proper hotel." "This is fine." Greta pressed a few crumpled marks into his palm, overpaying to ensure he wouldn't linger. She needed to face whatever waited inside these walls alone. The front door key provided by the lawyer turned with surprising ease. The heavy oak door swung open with a groan that seemed to echo from the house's bones, revealing a foyer shrouded in dust and shadow. Afternoon light filtered through dirty windows, illuminating particles that danced like memories in the stale air. Every step on the marble floor sent echoes racing through corridors she'd once run through as a child, chasing Wilhelmina's cats and dodging her governess's sharp rebukes. The house felt both familiar and foreign, as if she were walking through a photograph of her former life. In what had once been the library, she found the first surprise. The room had been stripped bare except for a single desk positioned beneath a window that offered a view of the overgrown maze in the back garden. On the desk lay a sealed envelope with her name written in Wilhelmina's spidery handwriting. Greta's hands trembled as she broke the wax seal, a formality that seemed absurdly theatrical until she unfolded the letter and read the first line. My dearest Greta, if you are reading this, then they haven't found it yet. The words seemed to pulse on the page. Found what? She continued reading, her aunt's familiar voice speaking from beyond the grave about trust accounts in Switzerland, about documents hidden in places where we used to leave gifts for the house spirits, about dangerous men who would come asking questions that must never be answered. The letter ended with coordinates, a string of numbers that meant nothing to Greta but everything to Wilhelmina, apparently. Below them, a warning that made her blood run cold. Trust no one who knew us before the war. The past has teeth, and it remembers everything. As if summoned by the words themselves, the sound of a car engine drifted through the broken window. Greta moved to peer through a gap in the boards, watching as a black Mercedes wound up the estate's circular drive. Two men in dark coats emerged, their movements precise and predatory. They weren't here to pay respects to the dead. The morning sun cast long shadows through the estate's grimy windows as Greta made her way to what had once been Aunt Margaret's study. She'd spent a restless night in the master bedroom, every creak of the old house making her wonder if someone might be watching, waiting. The lawyer's nervous demeanor yesterday had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. The study door groaned on rusted hinges as she pushed it open. Dust motes danced in the pale light filtering through moth-eaten curtains. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, their contents a mixture of leather-bound classics and what appeared to be agricultural journals dating back decades. Behind a massive mahogany desk sat a leather chair so worn the stuffing peeked through multiple tiers. Greta had hoped to find some explanation for her unexpected inheritance, perhaps letters or documents that might shed light on why Margarete had left everything to the niece she'd never acknowledged. The desk drawers yielded little: old fountain pens, dried ink bottles, receipts from local merchants. But as she pulled the bottom drawer completely free to examine it more thoroughly, her fingers found something unexpected. A small brass key had been taped to the drawer's underside. Her pulse quickened. In the camps, she'd learned that people hid their most precious possessions in the most unlikely places. She examined the key carefully. It was old but well-maintained, with an intricate pattern carved into its head. Too small for a door, perhaps meant for a jewelry box or safe. A systematic search of the study revealed nothing that matched the key. She moved through the house room by room, her frustration growing. The kitchen yielded only empty cupboards and a pantry that reeked of spoiled preserves. The parlor contained furniture draped in white sheets like ghosts of better times. It was in the cellar that she found what she was looking for. The stone steps were slick with moisture, and she had to feel her way down in the dim light from a single bulb. Wine racks lined one wall, still holding bottles coated in decades of dust. But it was the far corner that drew her attention. A heavy wooden chest sat partially concealed behind stacks of empty crates. The key fit perfectly. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were bundles of documents and what appeared to be certificates of some kind. But it was the leather portfolio at the bottom that made her hands tremble. Inside were bank statements, account numbers, and transfer records that made no sense. The figures were staggering. Millions of marks moving between accounts in Switzerland, Argentina, and other countries she couldn't immediately identify. A loose photograph slipped from between the pages and fluttered to the cellar floor. Greta picked it up, squinting in the poor light. It showed her aunt as a much younger woman standing beside a man in an SS uniform. They were smiling, his arm draped possessively around her shoulders. On the back, someone had written M. and Klaus, 1943. The blood drained from Greta's face. Klaus! She'd heard that name whispered in the camps, always with fear. Klaus Richter, one of the officers who disappeared at war's end, taking with him a fortune looted from victims across occupied Europe. Her legs gave out, and she sank onto an upturned crate, the implications crashing over her like a wave. The money that could save her, the inheritance that represented her only chance at a real life, was built on the suffering of people like herself, people who died while she somehow survived. But there was more. As she forced herself to continue reading, she discovered that the accounts were still active. Recent statements showed regular deposits, withdrawals, transfers. Someone had been managing this money for decades, keeping it moving, keeping it hidden. A sound from upstairs froze her blood, footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the house above. She stuffed the documents back into the portfolio, her hands shaking so badly she could barely manage it. The footsteps paused directly overhead, and she heard the unmistakable sound of furniture being moved. Someone was searching the house. Greta clutched the portfolio to her chest and looked around desperately for another way out. The cellar had only one entrance, the stairs she'd descended. She was trapped. The footsteps resumed, and she heard them on the kitchen floor, moving toward the cellar door. She quickly rewrapped the portfolio in the oiled cloth and shoved it behind the wine racks, then moved as quietly as she could to position herself behind the staircase. The cellar light clicked on from above, throwing harsh shadows across the stone walls. Heavy boots began their descent, each step echoing like a death knell. Greta pressed herself against the cold stone, hardly daring to breathe. Through the gaps between the wooden steps, she caught a glimpse of dark trousers, expensive shoes. The intruder reached the bottom and stood perfectly still, as if listening. Greta could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. After what felt like hours, the footsteps moved away from the stairs toward the wine racks where she'd hidden the documents. The morning brought no relief from the previous night's discoveries. Greta sat at the kitchen table, the leather journal spread before her like a map to territory she wasn't sure she wanted to explore. Sunlight filtered through grimy windows, casting pale rectangles across pages filled with her aunt's meticulous handwriting. Dates, names, amounts that made her stomach clench with their implications. Mars 1943, Oberfuhrer Kellner 50,000 M. Rands, safe passage through checkpoint. 22nd, 1943, Hauptmann Weber 25,000 M. Rands, transport documents. 8 Juni 1943, Standartenführer Braun 75,000. Each entry was a transaction, a piece of the machine that had devoured her country and everyone in it. But these weren't payments to the Reich. These were payments from it. Her aunt hadn't just survived the war, she had profited from it in ways that made Greta's hands shake as she turned each page. A sharp knock at the front door shattered her concentration. The journal snapped shut, as if it had a will of its own, and Greta found herself shoving it beneath a stack of old newspapers before she could think clearly. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she made her way through the cluttered hallway. Through the door's frosted glass she could make out two silhouettes, tall, angular, official. When she opened it, two men in dark coats stood on the threshold, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Fräulein Greta Hoffman? The older one spoke with the crisp pronunciation of educated Berlin. His pale eyes swept past her into the house's dim interior. Yes, I am Inspector Klaus Weber. This is my colleague, Herr Richter. We're investigating the circumstances surrounding your aunt's death. The name Weber struck her like a physical blow. Could this be the same Weber from the journal? The dates would make it possible. A Hauptmann in 1943 could easily be an inspector now if he'd navigated the post-war tribunals carefully enough. I thought her death was ruled natural causes. Greta kept her voice steady, though her grip on the doorframe tightened. Indeed it was. However, certain irregularities have come to our attention. Items that may have gone missing from the estate before probate. Weber's smile was thin and cold. We'd like to take a look around, if you don't mind. It wasn't really a question. Greta stepped aside, watching as the two men entered her aunt's house with the easy familiarity of people who had been here before. Richter immediately began examining the rooms they passed, his eyes cataloguing every detail with professional thoroughness. Your aunt lived quite modestly for someone of her resources, Weber observed, running a finger along the dusty mantelpiece in the parlor. I wasn't aware she had any resources. No? Weber's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. How curious. We have it on good authority that Fräulein Hoffman possessed certain valuable items, perhaps documents, papers of historical significance. They moved through the house like wolves following a scent, and Greta trailed behind them, acutely aware of the journal hidden in the kitchen just meters away. Every step felt like walking on ice that might crack and plunge her into depths she couldn't escape. In her aunt's bedroom, Richter had pulled out dresser drawers and was methodically searching through their contents. Weber examined the wardrobe, pushing aside threadbare dresses to peer into corners. "These historical documents," Greta said carefully. "What makes you think my aunt had them?" Weber paused in his search and turned to face her fully. "Your aunt was known to have certain connections during the war. Connections that might have left her in possession of sensitive materials. Materials that could be quite valuable to the right parties, or quite dangerous to the wrong ones," Richter added, without looking up from his systematic destruction of the dresser contents. The threat was unmistakable, delivered with the casual tone of men discussing the weather. Greta's mouth went dry as she realized she was standing in a room with two people who almost certainly knew exactly what her aunt had been involved in, and what they were really looking for. "I'm afraid you're mistaken," she said. "My aunt left nothing but furniture and debts." Weber studied her face with the intensity of a man reading a foreign language. "Perhaps, but you won't mind if we conduct a thorough search for everyone's peace of mind." It wasn't a request this time either. As the two men began their methodical dismantling of the bedroom, Greta excused herself and walked on unsteady legs back toward the kitchen. The journal seemed to burn through the newspapers concealing it, its secrets threatening to spill out and destroy everything. She had perhaps minutes before they reached the kitchen. Whatever decision she made now would determine whether she walked away from this house alive or joined her aunt in an early grave. The morning light revealed what darkness had mercifully hidden. Greta stood in the estate's main hall, watching dust motes dance through shafts of sunlight that streamed through cracked windows. The wallpaper peeled like diseased skin, and the floorboards groaned with each step as if the house itself were in pain. She'd spent the night in what had once been the library, wrapped in a moth-eaten blanket she'd found in an upstairs closet. Sleep had come in fragments, punctuated by the settling sounds of an old house and memories she couldn't quite silence. Every creak made her wonder if Klaus Müller had decided to pay another visit. The kitchen, when she found it, bore evidence of recent habitation. Not her aunt's. The dates on the expired tins suggested someone had been living here sporadically over the past year, squatters, perhaps, or someone with their own reasons for wanting to remain hidden. The thought should have unsettled her, but Greta had learned to find comfort in the presence of other survivors, even invisible ones. She was examining a water stain on the ceiling when she heard the automobile approaching. Through the grimy window, she watched a black Mercedes navigate the rutted drive with careful precision. This wasn't Klaus Müller's aggressive arrival. This was someone who belonged here. The man who emerged wore an expensive overcoat and carried himself with the measured dignity of the professional class. He was perhaps 60, with silver hair and the kind of face that suggested he'd spent the war years behind a desk rather than in a trench. When he knocked, it was with the patient rhythm of someone accustomed to being answered. "Fräulein Richter," his voice carried the crisp consonants of educated Berlin. "I am Otto Brennan, your late aunt's solicitor." Greta opened the door slowly, keeping one hand near the kitchen knife she'd tucked into her coat pocket. Trust was a luxury she'd learned to ration carefully. Brennan's eyes took in her appearance, the hollow cheeks, the wary posture, the clothes that hung loose on her diminished frame, with the practiced assessment of a man who'd spent recent years cataloguing loss. "I apologize for not meeting you yesterday. I was attending to some complications regarding your inheritance." He stepped inside without invitation, his gaze sweeping the deteriorated interior with what seemed like genuine sadness. Elizabeth always meant to restore this place. She spoke of it often, particularly in her final months. "You knew her well as anyone could know your aunt." She was a woman of considerable discretion. Brennan set his briefcase on a dusty table and withdrew a leather portfolio. "There are documents requiring your signature, and several matters we must discuss privately." Greta remained standing, arms crossed. "What kind of matters?" "The nature of your inheritance, for one. The property itself is worth very little in its current condition, but there are other assets, substantial ones." He paused, studying her face. "Your aunt was quite wealthy, Fräulein Richter, extraordinarily so." The words hung in the air like smoke. Greta had learned to be suspicious of sudden fortune. In her experience, windfalls usually came with teeth. Where did the money come from? Brennan's smile was thin as paper. Elizabeth had diverse investments, international concerns. She was remarkably astute in matters of finance. His fingers drummed against the portfolio. Of course, liquidating such assets requires time and discretion. There are parties who have expressed interest in purchasing certain holdings. What kind of parties? Businessmen, collectors of rare items, people who prefer to conduct their affairs away from official scrutiny. Brennan's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I must tell you, Fräulein, that your aunt's death was not entirely unexpected. She had been receiving pressure to sell, rather insistent pressure." Greta felt the familiar chill of recognition. She'd seen what happened to people who possessed things others wanted during the war years. The hunger in men's eyes when they scented weakness or opportunity. What kind of pressure? Visitors, phone calls at unusual hours, a break-in several months ago, though nothing appeared to be stolen. Brennan opened the portfolio and withdrew a thick envelope. "This contains account information and contact details for banks in Switzerland and Lisbon. Your aunt was very specific about the procedures for accessing these funds." He handed her the envelope, and she noticed his fingers trembled slightly. "I must also give you this warning, which Elizabeth insisted I deliver personally. There are people who believe these assets belong to them. They have considerable resources and few scruples about employing them." "Who are they?" "Men who prospered during the war years through methods that would not bear close examination. Men who helped things and people disappear, and who were well compensated for such services." Brennan closed his briefcase with sharp clicks. "Your aunt kept detailed records of her business relationships, perhaps too detailed for her own safety." Outside, another automobile was approaching. Brennan moved to the window, his face draining of color. "I must leave immediately," he whispered. "Study those documents carefully, Fräulein. And remember, trust no one completely, not even me." The morning light filtered through the grimy windows of the estate's kitchen as Greta sat hunched over a cup of weak coffee, her hands still trembling from the previous night's encounter. The torn photograph lay before her like pieces of a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. Heinrich Volker's face stared up at her from one fragment, younger but unmistakably the same man who had made her life hell in the camps. She had barely slept, her mind racing between memories of Tante Liesel and the horrifying realization that her aunt had somehow been connected to the SS officer who had tortured her. The neat handwriting on the back of the photograph, "Our benefactor, 1943, felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound. A knock at the front door jolted her from her brooding. Through the kitchen window, she could see a black Mercedes parked in the overgrown driveway, its chrome bumper gleaming despite the overcast sky. Her stomach lurched as she recognized the vehicle from the night before. Greta forced herself to remain seated, sipping her coffee with feigned calm as heavy footsteps echoed on the front porch. The knock came again, more insistent this time, followed by the rattle of the door handle. She had locked it, but the old mechanism was hardly reliable. "Fräulein Richter?" The voice was cultured, patient. "My name is Klaus Weber. I believe we have matters to discuss regarding your inheritance." She said nothing, hoping he would leave. Instead, she heard the scrape of metal against metal, and her blood ran cold as she realized he was picking the lock. The camps had taught her to recognize the sound of forced entry. Moving as quietly as possible, Greta slipped from the kitchen into the hallway, clutching the photograph fragments. The cellar door stood slightly ajar, and she remembered the hidden compartment behind the wine rack. If there were more secrets down there, she needed to find them before Weber did. The front door clicked open just as she descended into the musty darkness below. Her bare feet made no sound on the stone steps, but she could hear Weber's measured footsteps above, moving methodically through the ground floor. In the cellar, she fumbled for the loose brick behind the wine rack, her fingers finding the hidden catch. The panel swung open to reveal not just the metal box she had discovered before, but an entire hidden room beyond. A thin shaft of light from a concealed ventilation grate illuminated stacks of documents, more photographs, and what appeared to be accounting ledgers. Her hands shook as she grabbed the nearest ledger, scanning columns of figures and dates. The entries began in 1940 and continued through 1947, documenting transfers of money, gold, and other valuables. Names filled the margins. Some she recognized as prominent Nazi officials, others complete strangers. But one name appeared repeatedly: Volker. A floorboard creaked directly overhead. Weber was in the kitchen now, probably examining the coffee cup she had abandoned. She had minutes at most before he found the cellar entrance. Frantically, she stuffed several ledgers and photographs into a canvas bag she found in the corner. As she turned to leave, her foot knocked against something metallic. Looking down, she saw a small wooden crate filled with gold coins and jewelry. The actual source of her inheritance, not some legitimate family wealth. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Tante Liesel had been more than connected to the Nazis. She had been profiting from their crimes. The estate, the money that could solve all of Greta's problems, it was all built on the suffering of people like herself. Footsteps descended the cellar stairs. Weber had found her. "There's no need to hide, Fräulein Richter," his voice echoed in the stone chamber. "I'm here to help you understand your situation." Greta pressed herself against the back wall of the hidden room, hardly daring to breathe. Through the crack in the panel, she could see a beam of flashlight cutting through the darkness as Weber methodically searched the cellar. "Your aunt was a practical woman," he continued conversationally. "She understood that survival sometimes requires difficult choices. The war created opportunities for those wise enough to seize them." The light beam swept closer to the wine rack. Greta clutched the canvas bag to her chest, feeling the weight of evidence that could either damn her aunt's memory or provide the answers she desperately needed. "We simply want to conclude our business arrangement," Weber said. "Nothing more. Your aunt kept certain items that belong to our organization. Return them, and you may keep the rest of your inheritance without interference." The panel began to swing open, and Greta knew her hiding place had been discovered. But in that moment, clutching stolen Nazi gold while a war criminal's associate stood mere feet away, she realized that her aunt's legacy had placed her in the exact position she had spent years trying to escape. Trapped between powerful men who viewed human lives as expendable commodities. The only difference was that this time she held the key to their secrets. The morning light filtering through Tante Greta's dusty curtains revealed more than Ingrid had bargained for. She'd spent the night poring over the documents from the hidden compartment, her coffee growing cold as she traced connections that made her stomach churn. The fortune wasn't just money. It was a carefully orchestrated network of stolen assets, false identities, and transactions that spanned 3 decades. Her hands trembled as she spread the papers across the kitchen table. Bank accounts in Switzerland, numbered deposits from unnamed sources, and most damning of all, a ledger written in Greta's precise handwriting that detailed payments to former SS officers. The amounts were staggering. But what made Ingrid's blood run cold were the names she recognized. Men who had supposedly died in the war's final chaos, now living comfortable lives under assumed identities. A car door slammed outside, jolting her from her horrified reverie. Through the grimy window, she watched a black Mercedes pull up to the estate's front gate. 2 men in expensive coats emerged, their breath visible in the crisp morning air. They moved with the calculated precision of predators, and when the taller one removed his hat, Ingrid caught sight of a distinctive scar running from his left ear to his jaw. Her pulse quickened. She'd seen that scar before, in nightmares that still haunted her sleep. SS Oberfuhrer Klaus Weber, the man who had overseen her transfer from the POW camp to the labor facility where she'd nearly died. The man who was supposed to have been executed for war crimes. Ingrid's survival instincts, honed by years of imprisonment and post-war hardship, kicked in immediately. She swept the documents into the leather portfolio, her movements swift and silent. The men were examining the gate, testing its rusty hinges. They had perhaps 3 minutes before they reached the house. She raced upstairs to Greta's bedroom, her mind spinning through possibilities. The loose floorboard near the wardrobe, she pried it up and shoved the portfolio into the hollow space beneath, then replaced the board and kicked the threadbare rug back into position. Footsteps crunched on the gravel path below. By the time the doorbell's harsh chime echoed through the house, Ingrid had composed herself. She opened the door with the weary expression of a woman overwhelmed by grief and inheritance paperwork. Weber stood before her, his pale eyes scanning her face with predatory interest. "Fräulein Richter, I presume." His voice was cultured, betraying no hint of his brutal past. "I am Herr Steinberg, a business associate of your late aunt. This is my colleague, Herr Hoffman." The lie rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, but Ingrid's trained ear caught the slight Bavarian accent he couldn't quite suppress. She forced herself to meet his gaze, to show no recognition despite the memories clawing at her consciousness. "I'm afraid I don't know anything about Tante Greta's business affairs," she said, stepping aside to let them enter. "The lawyers are handling everything." Weber moved through the house with the confidence of someone familiar with its layout. His eyes catalogued every detail, searching for something specific. Hoffman remained by the door, his hand resting inside his coat in a gesture that made Ingrid's skin crawl. "Your aunt was quite the collector," Weber observed, running his finger along the dusty mantelpiece. "Art, antiquities, various items of historical significance. I'm particularly interested in some documents she may have kept. Personal papers, you understand." "I haven't found much beyond household bills and legal papers," Ingrid lied smoothly. "Most of her personal effects seem to have been disposed of years ago." Weber's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "How unfortunate. You see, your aunt owed certain debts, professional obligations that transcend death, one might say." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Ingrid felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with being cornered, but she'd learned long ago not to show fear to predators. If there are legitimate debts, the estate's lawyers will handle them through proper channels, she said firmly. "Of course." Weber moved closer, and she caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something metallic that made her think of blood. "But some matters require more immediate attention. Perhaps you could contact us when you've had more time to search through her belongings?" He placed a business card on the table. The name and company were obviously fabricated, but the phone number would be real. They wanted her to be able to reach them, which meant they weren't done with her yet. After they left, Ingrid watched from the window until the Mercedes disappeared down the winding country road. Her hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't from fear alone. It was rage, the same burning fury that had sustained her through the worst moments of captivity. Greta's fortune wasn't just blood money. It was leverage, a weapon that could expose the network of war criminals who had escaped justice. But wielding it would mean stepping back into a world that had already taken everything from her once. The question was whether she was strong enough to survive it a second time. The cigarette smoke curled between Heinrich Volker's fingers as he studied the photographs spread across his mahogany desk. Each black and white image captured Greta in sharp detail, entering the estate, walking through the village, speaking with the antiquarian in town. His network had been thorough, as always. "She's been asking questions," reported Klaus, a thin man with nervous eyes who shifted uncomfortably in the leather chair. "About the family history, about what happened during the war." The antiquarian mentioned she seemed particularly interested in her aunt's recent activities. Heinrich's jaw tightened imperceptibly. After 40 years of careful silence, the Richter woman was threatening to unravel everything he'd built. His steel empire, his political connections, his spotless reputation, all of it balanced precariously on secrets buried with the Third Reich. What else? She's been going through papers in the house. Our contact at the post office says she's received several documents from government archives. And there's been activity in the old wine cellar. The photographs showed Greta emerging from the estate's lower levels, dirt on her clothes, determination etched in her features. Heinrich had hoped the years in Soviet camps would have broken her spirit, made her grateful for simple survival. Instead, she'd returned with the same stubborn curiosity that had made her aunt so dangerous. Martha always was too clever for her own good, Heinrich murmured, crushing his cigarette in the crystal ashtray. And now her niece follows the same path. He stood and walked to the window overlooking the bustling industrial complex below. Smokestacks reached toward the grey sky, testament to the empire he'd carved from the rubble of a defeated nation. Few remembered the hungry young man who'd emerged from the war with nothing but ambition and a handful of well-placed secrets. Fewer still knew how he'd transformed those secrets into leverage, then power, then untouchable wealth. The Richter women knew too much. "Sir?" Klaus ventured. "What would you like me to do?" Heinrich turned back to the desk, his fingers drumming against the polished wood. Direct action was messy, drew attention. But allowing Greta to continue her investigation would be catastrophic. The documents Martha had hidden, the photographs, the financial records, if they surfaced now, prosecutors would have enough evidence to destroy not just him, but dozens of others who'd climbed to prominence on the bones of the past. "Double the surveillance," he said finally. "I want to know every person she speaks with, every document she examines." "And Klaus?" His voice carried a cold edge that made his subordinate straighten. "Ensure our other associates understand the gravity of the situation. This isn't merely about protecting old secrets anymore." After Klaus departed, Heinrich poured himself a brandy and returned to studying the photographs. Greta's face reminded him uncomfortably of Martha's. The same intelligent eyes, the same determined set to her jaw. During the war, that determination had made Martha useful. Later, it had made her dangerous. The phone on his desk rang, its shrill tone cutting through his thoughts. He answered on the second ring. "Heinrich." The voice belonged to Werner Hauptmann, another survivor of their wartime circle, now a prominent judge in Munich. "I've been hearing troubling rumors." "About what?" "The Richter estate. Word is that Martha's niece has returned from the East. People are asking questions about why the property was never properly settled, why certain documents were sealed." Heinrich's grip tightened on the receiver. If their network was beginning to panic, mistakes would follow. Panicked men did stupid things, left trails that clever investigators could follow. "Everything is under control," he said smoothly. "The woman is simply settling her inheritance, nothing more. You'd better hope so. Too many of us have too much to lose if old graves start giving up their dead." The line went quiet, leaving Heinrich alone with his thoughts and the photographs. He walked to his safe, spinning the combination with practiced ease, and withdrew a thick folder marked with dates from 1943. Inside were documents that would hang him if they ever saw daylight. Transfer orders, financial agreements, lists of names and amounts that told the story of systematic plunder dressed up as legitimate business. Martha had kept copies of everything. That much he knew from their final confrontation 3 months ago, when she demanded he stop his persecution of Greta's repatriation efforts. The foolish woman had actually threatened to expose their entire operation unless he used his influence to help her niece return to Germany. He'd agreed, of course. Then he'd arranged for Martha's unfortunate accident. But the copies remained hidden somewhere in that crumbling estate, and now Greta was systematically searching every corner of the property. It was only a matter of time before she found what her aunt had left for her. Heinrich returned the folder to his safe and reached for his telephone. The number he dialed connected him to a very different sort of associate, one whose services extended far beyond surveillance and intimidation. "I have a problem that requires a permanent solution," he said when the call connected. "How soon can you be here?" The rain hammered against the library windows as Greta spread the documents across her aunt's mahogany desk. 3 days had passed since her meeting with Klaus Weber, 3 days of careful preparation and mounting dread. The banker's words echoed in her mind. "There are people who would kill for what your aunt possessed." She had found them hidden behind a false panel in Margaretha's bedroom, ledgers dating back to 1943, written in her aunt's precise script. Names, dates, amounts, a meticulous record of transactions that made Greta's blood run cold. Gold teeth, wedding rings, family heirlooms, all catalogued with the same clinical efficiency she remembered from the camps. The knock at the front door came at exactly 9 o'clock, as arranged. Greta closed the ledger and walked through the darkened hallway, her footsteps echoing off the marble floors. Through the peephole, she could see Klaus Weber's anxious face, rain dripping from his grey hair. "You look terrible," she said, as she let him in. "I haven't slept since our conversation." He shook the water from his coat. "I keep thinking someone is watching me." "Someone probably is." Greta led him to the library, where a fire crackled in the stone fireplace. "I found what you were looking for." Weber's eyes widened as he saw the documents spread across the desk. He approached slowly, as if the papers might burst into flames. Mein Gott, she kept records of everything. Every theft, every transaction, every life destroyed. Greta's voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she opened the first ledger. "Look at this entry from October 1943. Received from H. Mueller, gold dental work, 847 grams, market value 3,200 Reichsmarks, storage location Zurich, account 7,429. Weber leaned over her shoulder, his breath catching. Heinrich Mueller. He was the banker who handled the SS accounts in this district. Was? Died in a car accident in 1962. Very convenient timing. Weber turned the page, scanning the entries. "Your aunt wasn't just a passive recipient, Greta. She was organizing the entire operation." The revelation hit Greta like a physical blow. She had suspected, but seeing the evidence laid out so methodically made it undeniable. Margaretha hadn't just profited from the Holocaust, she had helped orchestrate the systematic looting of its victims. "There's more." Greta walked to the fireplace, where she had placed a metal box retrieved from the basement. "I found this buried beneath the wine cellar." Inside the box were photographs, dozens of them. Nazi officials at elegant dinner parties. Margaretha, young and beautiful, on the arm of SS officers. Weber shuffled through them with growing horror. "Do you recognize any of them?" Greta asked. "This one." Weber held up a photograph showing Margaretha toasting with a man in SS uniform. "That's Oberfuhrer Ernst Zimmermann. He disappeared after the war, presumed dead. He studied the image more closely. But I've seen him before, recently." "What do you mean?" "At the bank. 3 weeks ago. He came asking about Margaretha's accounts, claimed to be a government investigator. But he was too young. This man would be nearly 90 now. His son? Possibly. Or someone else with a very strong interest in keeping these secrets buried." A car door slammed outside, the sound cutting through the rain. Greta moved to the window and peered through the heavy curtains. 2 black sedans sat in her driveway, engines running. "We have company," she whispered. Weber joined her at the window. "We need to leave. Now." "No." Greta's voice was firm. "I'm tired of running. I've been running my entire life. This is different. These people destroyed my family, my country, my life. And now they want to silence me to protect their dirty money." Greta moved back to the desk, gathering the most incriminating documents. "I won't let that happen." The front door exploded inward with a thunderous crash. Heavy footsteps echoed through the hallway. Greta quickly stuffed several key documents into her jacket, while Weber stood frozen by the window. "Is there another way out?" he whispered. "The servants' staircase. It leads to the kitchen." They could hear voices now, speaking in clipped German. Professional, military, getting closer. Greta grabbed the metal box and led Weber to a concealed door behind the bookshelf. As they slipped into the narrow staircase, she could hear the men entering the library. One of them cursed when he saw the open ledgers on the desk. They moved through the darkness, feeling their way down the steep steps. Behind them, furniture crashed and papers rustled as the intruders searched frantically. At the bottom of the stairs, Greta pushed open the kitchen door just enough to peer out. The back garden was empty, but she could see the glow of cigarettes near the rear gate. They were surrounded. What now? Weber's voice was barely audible. Greta thought of the tunnels Margareta had mentioned in her letters, the ones used to hide valuables during the bombing raids. She had explored them as a child during her few visits to the estate. "Follow me," she whispered, leading him toward the cellar door. "And pray those tunnels still connect to the old mill." The letter arrived at dawn, slipped beneath her door like a whispered threat. Greta found it when she descended to the kitchen, the cream-colored envelope stark against the dark floorboards. Her name was written across it in elegant script that made her stomach clench with recognition. She had seen that handwriting before, in the documents hidden within Aunt Margareta's walls. Her hands trembled as she broke the wax seal. The message inside was brief, written in the same flowing hand. "The Goldman collection requires immediate discussion. Café Sacre, 3 p.m. Come alone, or others will make the choice for you." It was unsigned, but the threat was unmistakable. Someone knew about the paintings. Someone knew she had found them. Greta spent the morning pacing the estate's empty corridors, her mind racing through possibilities. Had Klaus betrayed her after all? Had someone been watching the house? The weight of the Luger in her coat pocket provided little comfort as she considered her options. By afternoon, rain had begun to fall in sheets across Vienna, turning the cobblestones treacherous and giving the city a grey, mournful cast. The Café Sacre hummed with the quiet conversations of well-dressed patrons seeking refuge from the weather. Greta chose a corner table where she could watch both entrances, her back to the wall. She didn't have to wait long. The man who approached her table moved with the calculated grace of someone accustomed to power. Silver-haired and impeccably dressed, he carried himself with an authority that made other patrons unconsciously step aside. When he sat across from her without invitation, his pale eyes held the coldness of winter lakes. "Fräulein Müller." His voice carried a slight accent she couldn't place. "I am Heinrich Brenner. I believe you have something that belongs to me. I don't know what you're talking about." The lie felt hollow even as she spoke it. Brenner smiled, but the expression never reached his eyes. "Your aunt was a remarkable woman, resourceful. She understood the value of discretion." He paused to signal the waiter for coffee. "Unfortunately, discretion died with her." "What do you want?" "What I have always wanted. The return of property that was unlawfully taken from me." He leaned forward slightly. "You see, during the unpleasantness of the war, certain valuable items were removed from my family's collection, items that found their way into unauthorized hands." Greta's pulse quickened. "You're talking about stolen art." "I prefer to think of it as temporarily misplaced." His coffee arrived, and he stirred it with deliberate precision. "Your aunt came to possess several pieces from my collection. I had hoped to resolve the matter quietly with her, but she proved uncooperative." The implication hung in the air like smoke. "You killed her." "Your aunt died of a heart attack, as I'm sure the official records will show." Brenner's tone remained conversational, as if discussing the weather. "Though I will admit that our final conversation may have been somewhat stressful for her." Rage flared in Greta's chest, hot and sudden. Her hand moved instinctively toward her coat pocket, but Brenner's next words stopped her cold. "I should mention that you're being watched. 3 of my associates are positioned throughout this café. Any sudden movements would be inadvisable." She forced her hand to remain still, fighting every instinct that screamed at her to run. "What do you want from me?" "Cooperation. The paintings you discovered are worth a considerable fortune, but they are worthless to you. You cannot sell them, cannot display them, cannot even acknowledge their existence without inviting scrutiny neither of us desires." He sipped his coffee. "Return them to me, and I will ensure your continued good health. Refuse, and you will discover that accidents can happen to anyone. And if I've already contacted the authorities—" "Have you?" His smile widened at her silence. "I thought not. You see, Fräulein, you are in a position remarkably similar to your aunt's. Those paintings represent stolen Nazi plunder. Their presence in your possession raises uncomfortable questions about your family's wartime activities, questions that might interest certain investigators. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Keep the paintings and face Brenner's wrath, or surrender them and lose her only chance at financial security. Either choice left her vulnerable. I need time to consider." "Of course, but don't take too long." Brenner rose smoothly, leaving money on the table for his coffee. "You have until tomorrow evening. I will send instructions on where to make the delivery." He paused beside her chair, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Your aunt thought she could outsmart me, Fräulein. She believed she had hidden the paintings where I could never find them. But everyone has pressure points. Everyone has weaknesses that can be exploited." His hand briefly touched her shoulder, the gesture somehow more menacing than any open threat. "I do hope you prove more reasonable than she was." Then he was gone, leaving Greta alone with the taste of fear and the certain knowledge that she was running out of time. The cellar beneath Aunt Margaret's estate reeked of decades-old dampness and something else, something metallic that made Greta's stomach turn. Heinrich's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating stone walls that wept with moisture and shadows that seemed to writhe just beyond the light's reach. "There," Heinrich whispered, pointing to a section of wall where the stones looked newer, their mortar less weathered. "Help me with this." They worked in silence, prying at the loose stones with tools Heinrich had brought from the gardening shed. Greta's hands trembled as each stone came free, revealing a cavity behind. The metallic smell grew stronger. The flashlight beam penetrated the opening, and Greta gasped. Stacks of documents wrapped in oilcloth, several small wooden boxes, and behind them, glinting in the light, bars of gold arranged in neat rows. "Mein Gott," Heinrich breathed. "Your aunt, she kept everything." Greta reached for the nearest bundle of documents, unwrapping them carefully. The papers were yellowed with age, but the Nazi letterhead was unmistakable. Transport schedules, lists of names, payment receipts signed with Margareta's maiden name signature. "She was involved," Greta said, her voice barely audible. "She helped them move things, people." Her eyes fell on a particular document, a manifest listing the contents of a transport from a camp she recognized, the same camp where she'd lost everything. "She profited from our suffering." Heinrich's hand found her shoulder. "You couldn't have known." But as Greta continued reading, another picture emerged. Later documents showed Margareta's gradual turn against her former associates. Records of bribes paid to help prisoners escape. Lists of officials she'd blackmailed with evidence of their crimes. The final papers, dated near the war's end, detailed her systematic collection of evidence against the network she'd once served. She was documenting everything, Greta realized, building cases against them all. A loud creak from above froze them both. Heinrich switched off the flashlight instantly, plunging them into absolute darkness. Footsteps moved across the floor overhead, slow, deliberate, searching. Greta pressed herself against the cold stone wall, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would give them away. Heinrich's breathing was barely audible beside her. The footsteps paused directly above them. Then voices, two men speaking in low tones. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably threatening. One voice rose slightly. "Must be here somewhere. The old woman wouldn't have destroyed it." A crash echoed from upstairs as furniture was overturned. These men weren't here to steal family silver. They knew exactly what they were looking for. Heinrich's hand found hers in the darkness, squeezing gently. They had to wait it out. Any attempt to leave now would be suicide. The search continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, the footsteps moved toward the rear of the house. Heinrich waited several more minutes before clicking the flashlight back on, keeping it aimed low. "We need to get this evidence out of here," he whispered. "Tonight." Greta nodded, already selecting the most damning documents. But as she lifted one of the wooden boxes, its contents shifted with a sound like small bones rattling. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside were dozens of rings, wedding bands mostly, some still bearing traces of engravings. Her blood turned to ice. She knew what these were: jewelry taken from prisoners, melted down and resold by people like her aunt. For a moment, the weight of generational guilt threatened to crush her. "We have to make this right," she said, her voice stronger than she felt, whatever the cost. Heinrich was already packing documents into a canvas bag he'd brought. "The gold alone is worth more than most people see in a lifetime, but with this evidence—" He held up a particular paper that made his face go pale. "This implicates people who are still alive, still in power. Good." Greta sealed the box of rings carefully. They deserve to face justice. Another sound from upstairs made them freeze again, but this time it was different. The front door slamming shut, an engine starting outside. Their unwelcome visitors were leaving, but they'd be back. "They'll return with more men," Heinrich said, as they quickly gathered everything they could carry. "And they'll tear this place apart." As they made their way up the cellar stairs, Greta felt the weight of more than just the evidence they carried. The fortune that had seemed like salvation an hour ago now felt like a curse. Every bar of gold, every document, every piece of jewelry represented someone's suffering and someone else's determination to keep that suffering hidden. But she'd survived worse than threats from war criminals. She'd endured camps, rejection by her own family, and decades of poverty. Now she had both the means and the evidence to ensure justice was finally served. The question was whether she'd live long enough to see it through. The rain hammered against the manor's windows as Greta pressed herself against the cold stone wall of the wine cellar, listening to footsteps echo through the corridors above. 3 days had passed since she'd discovered the hidden account numbers, and now they were here, the same men who had ransacked her aunt's study, searching for what she now possessed. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the leather portfolio containing the documents. The Swiss bank statements revealed amounts that made her dizzy, millions transferred systematically over decades, all bearing her aunt's signature and a corporate seal she didn't recognize. But it was the accompanying correspondence that had stolen her breath entirely. Heinrich's name appeared on every page. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by hushed voices speaking German with Berlin accents. Greta recognized the cadence, the clipped efficiency that transported her instantly back to the camps. Her chest tightened, but she forced herself to breathe silently. She had survived worse than this. The woman must have found something by now. A voice drifted down through the floorboards. Hella was thorough, but these old houses have secrets. Greta's blood chilled. They knew about her aunt's lawyer, knew about his death, which meant they also knew it hadn't been an accident. She crept deeper into the cellar, past rows of wine bottles covered in decades of dust, toward the narrow passage she'd discovered behind the far wall. Her aunt had been more paranoid than eccentric. She'd built escape routes throughout the manor, remnants perhaps of wartime fears that had never fully subsided. The passage led to the groundskeeper's cottage, abandoned since her aunt had let the staff go years ago. Greta emerged into the small kitchen, rain-soaked and shivering, still gripping the portfolio. Through the cottage window, she could see lights moving through the manor's windows like predatory eyes. She needed answers before they found her. The documents painted a clear picture of systematic theft, art, gold, valuables stolen from Jewish families during the war and funneled through a network that had somehow survived intact into the present day. Her aunt hadn't been a victim of this network. She'd been a crucial part of it. But Heinrich's involvement remained a mystery that gnawed at her. His letters to her aunt spoke of maintaining discretion and protecting our arrangement. The dates spanned from 1943 through the previous year. Either Heinrich had been part of this conspiracy for decades, or someone had been using his identity long after the war. Greta's mind raced back to their conversations, searching for clues she'd missed. Heinrich had always been evasive about his past, claiming his memories of the war years were fragmented from a head injury. But he'd known details about her experiences that she'd never shared with anyone, details only someone with access to official records could possess. The sound of splintering wood carried across the courtyard. They'd broken down the manor's front door. Time was running out. She needed to reach the village, find somewhere with a telephone, contact someone who could help her make sense of this nightmare. But as she prepared to leave the cottage, a new set of headlights swept across the driveway. A black Mercedes emerged from the rain, and Greta's heart nearly stopped as she recognized the figure stepping out of the passenger seat. Heinrich moved with purpose toward the manor, his familiar limp more pronounced in the wet weather. But everything else about him seemed different. His posture straighter, his movements more authoritative. This wasn't the gentle, damaged man who had been courting her in the village. This was someone else entirely. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Heinrich hadn't been using a false identity. He'd been using his real one all along. The man who'd befriended her, who'd made her feel human again after everything she'd endured, was one of the architects of the very system that had destroyed so many lives, including, quite possibly, her own family's. She watched through the rain-streaked window as Heinrich entered the manor, clearly familiar with its layout. Her aunt's paranoia hadn't been the product of age and isolation. It had been entirely justified. She'd been living with the knowledge that her former partners might eventually come for their share of the stolen fortune. Greta's hands shook as she opened the portfolio again, studying the documents with new understanding. The account numbers weren't just evidence of past crimes, they were the key to a treasure that multiple parties were willing to kill for. Her aunt had tried to take it all, to disappear with decades of accumulated wealth. Her death had been the inevitable consequence. Now Greta held the same dangerous knowledge, the same deadly inheritance. She could disappear, use the money to start over somewhere far from these ghosts, or she could fight back, find a way to expose the truth and honor the memory of those who had suffered. Thunder crashed overhead as she made her choice, tucking the portfolio inside her coat and slipping out into the storm. The cellar beneath Tante Greta's estate stretched deeper than Ingrid had imagined, its stone walls weeping with decades of accumulated moisture. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing chambers that seemed to have been carved from the earth itself rather than built. The air tasted of secrets and decay. Heinrich's breathing echoed behind her as they descended the narrow stone steps. His injured shoulder made their progress slow, but his determination matched her own. They'd come too far to turn back now, especially with Klaus Brenner's men likely regrouping above ground. "There," Heinrich whispered, pointing to an iron door set into the far wall. Unlike the rusted hinges and corroded metal they'd encountered elsewhere, this door appeared well maintained, its surface bearing the distinctive markings of recent use. Ingrid approached cautiously, running her fingers along the door's edge until she found the hidden mechanism Greta had described in her letter. A section of the frame shifted under pressure, revealing a combination lock that gleamed despite the cellar's dampness. The numbers came to her unbidden, the date of her liberation from the camp, the one piece of information only she and Greta had shared in their brief correspondence before her aunt's death. As the tumblers clicked into place, Ingrid felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground cold. The door swung open with surprising ease, revealing a chamber that defied everything she thought she knew about her aunt's modest circumstances. Wooden crates lined the walls, each bearing shipping labels from Swiss banks and American financial institutions. Documents in protective cases filled metal shelving units, and in the center of the room sat a desk that appeared to serve as some kind of command center. Heinrich whistled low under his breath. Your aunt was more than she seemed. Ingrid moved to the desk, her flashlight illuminating ledgers written in Greta's precise handwriting. Names, dates, and astronomical figures filled page after page. But it was the photographs tucked between the ledger pages that made her blood run cold. Klaus Brenner, decades younger but unmistakable, standing beside men in SS uniforms. The same men whose names appeared in Greta's careful documentation. The same men who, according to these records, had been systematically moving stolen assets through a network that stretched from Germany to South America. She was tracking them, Ingrid breathed, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking together. All these years she was building a case. Heinrich leaned over her shoulder, his good arm supporting him against the desk. Look at this. He pointed to a section marked with red ink. Brenner wasn't just involved in the original theft, he's been using these funds to finance something current. The documentation revealed a web of shell companies and false identities, all leading back to a central fund that had grown exponentially over the years. But the most recent entries showed massive withdrawals, payments made to individuals whose names Ingrid didn't recognize but whose purposes were chillingly clear from Greta's annotations. Arms dealers, mercenaries, political extremists. He's planning something big, she whispered, her hands trembling as she turned the pages. This isn't just about hiding old crimes. This money is funding something that's going to happen. A sound from above made them both freeze, footsteps on the main floor, moving with the systematic precision of a search. Brenner's men had found the entrance. Heinrich grabbed as many documents as he could carry with his good arm, while Ingrid stuffed the most damning evidence into her coat. The ledgers were too numerous to take, but she photographed key pages with the small camera she'd learned to carry during her dangerous months of investigation. There has to be another way out, Heinrich whispered urgently. Your aunt was too careful to build a trap with only one exit. Ingrid scanned the chamber frantically, her flashlight beam dancing across the walls until it caught something, a section of the back wall that didn't quite match the others. She pressed against it and felt it give slightly. They squeezed through the opening just as the outer cellar door burst open. Flashlight beams pierced the darkness behind them, and shouts echoed off the stone walls. The tunnel was barely wide enough for one person, forcing them to move in single file through the suffocating darkness. The passage seemed to extend forever, occasionally branching off into smaller tributaries that Ingrid hoped led to dead ends for their pursuers. Her lungs burned from the stale air, and Heinrich's labored breathing behind her reminded her that he was operating on borrowed strength. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, she saw it, a faint grey light filtering down from above. The tunnel ended at a metal grate that looked out onto the forest beyond the estate grounds. As they emerged into the pre-dawn darkness, Ingrid clutched the documents that would either be their salvation or their death warrant. Behind them, the estate's windows blazed with artificial light as Brenner's men continued their futile search. But they had what they came for. Now they just had to live long enough to use it. The cellar's stone walls pressed in around Greta as she crouched behind a towering wine rack, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Above her, footsteps echoed through the manor's main floor, measured, deliberate searching. She clutched the leather satchel containing the documents that had turned her quiet inheritance into a death sentence. The beam of a flashlight swept down the cellar stairs, casting dancing shadows across the ancient stonework. Greta pressed herself deeper into the alcove, feeling the rough texture of centuries-old mortar against her back. Her fingertips found the hidden switch Aunt Marlene had shown her during childhood visits, a mechanism that opened a passage to the old smuggler's tunnel. "She's here somewhere," a voice called from upstairs, American accent coldly professional. "The car's still warm. Check every room." More footsteps scattered across the floor above, accompanied by the sound of doors slamming and furniture being overturned. They were being thorough, systematic. These weren't the local thugs who'd burned down her apartment. This was something much more dangerous. The flashlight beam descended further, illuminating dusty wine bottles and cobwebs. Greta held her breath as the light swept past her hiding spot, missing her by inches. The hidden panel clicked open silently behind her, revealing a narrow passage that smelled of earth and decades of disuse. She slipped into the tunnel just as boots reached the cellar floor. The passage was barely wide enough for her shoulders, forcing her to move in an awkward crouch. Somewhere behind her, she heard bottles crashing to the floor as her pursuers began their search in earnest. The tunnel stretched endlessly in the darkness, sloping gradually upward. Her hands traced the rough-hewn walls, following a path she'd explored as a curious child, but never imagined she'd need for survival. The documents in her satchel contained proof of Operation Bernhard, the Nazi counterfeiting scheme that had produced millions in fake currency. But more damning were the recent bank records showing how those bills had been laundered through Swiss and American institutions over the past 3 decades. The tunnel branched, and she paused, trying to remember which path led to the old gamekeeper's cottage. Her heart hammered as she heard voices echo through the passage behind her. They'd found the entrance. She chose the left fork, moving faster now despite the cramped conditions. The air grew fresher, carrying hints of pine and damp earth. Behind her, the voices grew closer, accompanied by the harsh glare of flashlights cutting through the darkness. The tunnel ended abruptly at a wooden door, swollen with moisture and age. Greta threw her shoulder against it, and it gave way with a groan that seemed to echo through the entire hillside. She tumbled out into the pre-dawn darkness, finding herself in the overgrown garden behind the abandoned cottage. Snow had begun to fall, creating a thin white veil across the landscape. She could see the lights of the manor in the distance and the dark shapes of vehicles surrounding it. More than she'd expected. This wasn't just about the money anymore. The documents she carried could implicate people in the highest levels of government and finance. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she made her way through the trees, using the cottage as cover. The old structure had been empty for years, but she remembered that the gamekeeper had once kept a motorcycle in the shed behind it. The shed door hung askew on rusted hinges. Inside, beneath a mouldering tarp, she found what she'd hoped for, an ancient BMW motorcycle covered in dust but potentially functional. The key hung from a nail on the wall, a testament to the trusting nature of rural life that had vanished with the war. The engine turned over on the 3rd try, coughing to life with a sound that seemed deafeningly loud in the quiet forest. Immediately she saw flashlights appear at the tunnel entrance behind the cottage. Shouts carried across the snow-covered ground. Greta gunned the engine and shot out from behind the shed, the rear wheels spinning in the loose snow before finding traction. The headlight beam carved through the falling snow as she navigated the overgrown path that led away from the estate. A spotlight blazed to life from the direction of the manor, sweeping across the forest in wide arcs. The beam passed over her twice before locking on, and she heard the roar of more powerful engines starting up in pursuit. The path emerged onto a secondary road that wound down through the valley. She leaned low over the handlebars, pushing the old motorcycle to its limits while fighting to maintain control on the increasingly treacherous surface. In her rearview mirror, she could see headlights gaining ground, modern vehicles with better traction and more power. The village of Steinfeld appeared ahead, its few streetlights creating pools of yellow warmth in the darkness. She had perhaps minutes before her pursuers caught up, and she needed to make a choice that would determine not just her survival, but the fate of everyone whose lives were documented in the leather satchel pressed against her ribs. The sound of approaching engines cut through the morning air like a death knell. Greta pressed herself against the cold stone wall of the estate's wine cellar, her heart hammering against her ribs. Above, she could hear boots on the floorboards. Too many pairs, too organized to be anything but professional. She had perhaps minutes before they discovered the hidden entrance behind the false wine rack. The documents Klaus had died protecting lay scattered around her feet, illuminated by the weak beam of her flashlight. Bank account numbers, names of Nazi officials who had escaped to South America, and most damning of all, a complete list of Swiss accounts holding looted Jewish gold that had never been returned. Her aunt's fortune wasn't just blood money. It was a repository of evidence that could topple governments and destroy careers spanning decades. The cellar's stone walls seemed to press closer as voices filtered down from above. She recognized Wagner's cultured tone, issuing crisp commands in German. They had found her sanctuary at last. Greta's fingers trembled as she gathered the most crucial documents, stuffing them into the waterproof pouch Klaus had given her during their final meeting. The irony wasn't lost on her. Once again, she was hiding in darkness while hunters searched for her above. But this time, she held the power to fight back. A grinding sound echoed through the cellar. They had found the mechanism. She extinguished her flashlight and felt along the far wall until her fingers found the narrow drainage channel her aunt had mentioned in her letters. It was barely wide enough for a person carved centuries ago to carry water away from the estate's foundations. Now it might carry Greta to freedom or to her tomb. The wine rack groaned as it swung open. Flashlight beams swept across the cellar like searchlights in a prison yard. Greta squeezed into the drainage channel just as the first boots hit the stone steps. The tunnel reeked of stagnant water and decay. Sharp stones tore at her clothes as she crawled forward on hands and knees, guided only by the faint current of air that suggested an exit somewhere ahead. Behind her, shouts erupted as they discovered the scattered papers she hadn't been able to collect. "Find her!" Wagner's voice carried clearly through the stone. "She can't have gone far." The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly. Greta's knees were raw and bleeding, her palms scraped from the rough stone. Just when she thought her lungs might burst from the fetid air, she saw it, a dim circle of grey light ahead. She emerged behind a tangle of overgrown bushes at the base of the hill, gasping and covered in filth. The estate loomed above her, its windows now blazing with artificial light as Wagner's team systematically searched every room. At least 6 black vehicles surrounded the building, their occupants moving with military precision. Greta pulled out the encrypted phone Klaus had given her, his final gift before Hoffman's bullet found its mark. The screen showed a single contact: insurance. Klaus had made her memorize the protocol. If everything went wrong, if the official channels proved compromised, there was one journalist who could be trusted with the truth. The phone rang once before a woman's voice answered in accented English. "You have something for me?" "The Hoffman files," Greta whispered, using the code phrase Klaus had taught her. "All of them." A pause. "Location?" Greta gave her coordinates, then added, "They killed Klaus Brenner. They're trying to kill me. The money trail leads everywhere. Swiss banks, Vatican accounts, American corporations. It's all here." 20 minutes, the voice replied. "Stay alive that long." The phone went dead. Greta deleted the call log and powered down the device. 20 minutes might as well be 20 hours with Wagner's hunters scouring the countryside for her. She forced herself to think like the survivor she had always been. The old mill pond lay just beyond the next ridge. She could hide in the ruins until help arrived. But as she started to move, a branch snapped behind her. "Going somewhere, Fräulein Fischer." She turned slowly to find Wagner emerging from the trees, his expensive suit somehow immaculate despite the rough terrain. 2 armed men flanked him, their weapons trained on her chest. "Your aunt caused us considerable trouble," Wagner continued, stepping closer. "We had hoped to conclude this matter quietly when she died, but she was more thorough than we anticipated. Hidden accounts, duplicate records, insurance policies scattered across half of Europe. The world deserves to know the truth," Greta said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Wagner smiled without warmth. "The world deserves stability, order. The past is a luxury we can no longer afford." He nodded to his men. "Search her, everything." As rough hands patted her down, Greta felt them find and remove the document pouch. But they missed the micro-drive sewn into her coat's lining, Klaus's backup plan containing digital copies of everything. "Is this all of it?" Wagner demanded, examining the papers. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of helicopter rotors approaching. The cellar beneath Aunt Margaret's estate felt like a tomb, its stone walls weeping with decades of accumulated moisture. Greta pressed her back against the cold masonry, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as footsteps echoed overhead. 3 sets of boots, maybe 4, moving with deliberate precision through the rooms above. She clutched the leather portfolio against her chest, its contents now burned into her memory. Bank records from Switzerland, correspondence with Nazi officials, names and account numbers that painted a picture so damning it made her stomach churn. Her aunt hadn't just hidden money, she'd been part of a network that had laundered stolen assets from concentration camps, including the one where Greta had nearly died. The bitter irony wasn't lost on her. The fortune that could save her from poverty had been built on the suffering of people like herself. Heavy footsteps crossed the floor directly above her head, followed by the sound of furniture being overturned. Heinrich Volker's men were being thorough, but they hadn't found the cellar entrance yet. The hidden door behind the kitchen pantry was well concealed, just as Aunt Margarete had intended when she'd had it installed in 1943. Greta's fingers traced the edge of a photograph she'd found among the documents, her aunt shaking hands with an SS officer, both of them smiling beside stacks of wooden crates. On the back, someone had written "Final Shipment, Mauthausen, April 1945. The camp where Greta's younger sister had died of typhus just weeks before liberation. A crash from upstairs made her flinch, glass shattering, followed by muffled voices. She caught fragments of conversation through the floorboards, something about the documents, about making it look like an accident. Her death would be just another casualty in Volker's campaign to bury the past. But Greta had survived worse than Heinrich Volker. She'd endured starvation, disease, and the daily brutality of the camps. She'd watched friends die and somehow found the strength to keep breathing when breathing felt like betrayal. A few corrupt businessmen in expensive suits wouldn't break her now. Moving carefully in the darkness, she felt along the cellar's far wall until her fingers found what she was looking for. A second concealed door, this one leading to a tunnel that connected to the old root cellar behind the estate's greenhouse. Margarete had been paranoid about escape routes, and her paranoia might just save Greta's life. The tunnel was narrow and clogged with spider webs, forcing her to crawl on her hands and knees while clutching the portfolio. The earth smelled of decay and old secrets, and more than once she had to stop to control her breathing as claustrophobia threatened to overwhelm her. The camps had left her with a deep fear of enclosed spaces, of being trapped with no way out. Behind her, she heard a distant shout. They'd found the cellar entrance. She pushed forward faster, ignoring the sharp stones that cut into her palms and knees. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, but finally she saw a dim outline of light ahead. The root cellar was empty except for rotting wooden shelves and the lingering smell of old vegetables. Greta pulled herself through the opening and immediately began looking for a way out. The cellar's wooden doors opened onto a small grove of trees behind the greenhouse, providing cover from anyone watching the main house. She emerged into the grey afternoon light and paused to catch her breath. From here she could see Volker's men moving through the house, their flashlight beams cutting through the windows. Soon they would discover both escape routes, but by then she would be gone. The portfolio felt heavier now, weighted with the knowledge of what it contained. Every document was evidence of crimes that went far beyond simple theft. They detailed a systematic network of corruption that had continued long after the war ended, reaching into banks, government offices, and corporate boardrooms across Germany. Greta thought of her sister Anna, of all the people who had died while men like Volker profited from their suffering. The money in those Swiss accounts was blood money, but the documents themselves were weapons. In the right hands they could bring down the entire network. She moved through the trees toward the old groundskeeper's cottage at the edge of the estate. If her memory served, there was a telephone there, one that Volker's men wouldn't know about. She had calls to make, alliances to forge. The journalist in Munich who'd been investigating war criminals, the prosecutor in Frankfurt who'd made his career hunting Nazi collaborators. The game had changed now. She was no longer just trying to survive. She was going to fight back. And she was going to win, not just for herself, but for Anna, and for everyone who'd been betrayed by people like her aunt and Heinrich Volker. The cottage appeared through the trees, its windows dark but promising. Justice had waited 20 years. It could wait a few hours more. The rain hammered against the estate's windows as Greta pressed her back against the cellar wall, clutching the leather portfolio that contained everything: bank records, photographs, names of Nazi collaborators who had built fortunes on stolen Jewish wealth. Her aunt's legacy wasn't just money, it was evidence that could topple governments and destroy dynasties. Footsteps echoed above, deliberate and searching. They had found her. "Miss Weber," a voice called down the stairs, cultured and patient. "My name is Heinrich Volker. I believe you have something that belongs to my associates." Greta's blood turned to ice. She recognized that name from the documents, one of the financiers who had laundered millions through Swiss banks, money stripped from families sent to die in camps, like the one that had nearly killed her. The irony was suffocating. Her survival had led her to the very people who had orchestrated her suffering. "Your aunt was a foolish woman," Volker continued, his polished shoes appearing on the wooden steps. "She thought she could play both sides and keep detailed records as insurance. But insurance only works if you're alive to collect." Greta slipped deeper into the shadows between the wine racks, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it. The portfolio felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. In it were the real names behind the shell companies, the current addresses of war criminals living as respected businessmen in Argentina and Switzerland, and most damaging of all, bank account numbers that were still active, still growing. "You cannot hide forever," Volker said, reaching the bottom of the stairs. A flashlight beam swept across the cellar. "My colleagues are quite motivated to retrieve those documents. You see, several of us are facing elections, board appointments, diplomatic positions. Scandal would be inconvenient." The beam passed inches from her face. Greta held her breath, tasting dust and terror. She thought of her parents, who had never lived to see justice, of the children in the camp who had died clutching photographs of families they would never see again. This portfolio wasn't just evidence, it was their voice. Volker's footsteps moved closer. "Perhaps we can reach an arrangement. The money your aunt left you, keep it, all of it. Live comfortably. We ask only for your discretion and the return of certain papers." Greta's fingers tightened around the portfolio's handle. The offer was tempting. With that money she could disappear, start over somewhere far from the ghosts that haunted her nights. She could buy peace, safety, perhaps even happiness. But she had learned something in the camps that these men would never understand. Dignity wasn't negotiable. Some things were worth more than survival. She thought of Klaus, who had risked everything to help her uncover the truth. Of the local police inspector, who had promised to coordinate with international war crimes investigators. They were counting on her courage. The flashlight beam found her. "There you are," Volker smiled, but his eyes remained cold. Two other men appeared behind him, their hands resting inside their coats. "Now, let us discuss this like civilized people." Greta straightened, meeting his gaze. "Civilized? You want to talk about civilization after what you helped do? The war is over, Miss Weber. We all did what we had to do to survive. Surely someone who endured the camps understands pragmatism. I understand that you sold your soul for profit while people like my parents burned." She clutched the portfolio tighter. "And I understand that you're terrified because finally someone has proof." Volker's expression hardened. "Give me the portfolio and walk away. This is your only chance." "No." The word came out stronger than she felt. "This ends now." One of the men behind Volker reached into his coat, but Greta was already moving. She had learned to be fast in the camps, to anticipate violence before it struck. She threw herself behind a wine barrel as the first shot shattered bottles above her head. "Don't kill her yet," Volker shouted. "We need to know if there are copies." Greta crawled through the chaos, broken glass cutting her hands, wine mixing with blood on the cellar floor. She reached the far wall where her aunt had shown her the secret passage years ago, a smuggler's tunnel from the estate's original construction. Behind her, the men were shouting, their flashlights creating wild shadows as they searched. She found the hidden lever and pulled. The wall section swung inward, revealing a narrow passage that led to the woods beyond the estate. As she squeezed through the opening, portfolio pressed against her chest, she heard Volker curse. "Find her! Search every inch of this place!" But Greta was already running through the tunnel, her aunt's final gift carrying her toward justice. In 12 hours, she would deliver the portfolio to the authorities. Tonight, she would honor the dead by refusing to let their murderers escape again. The tunnel ended in moonlight and freedom, but she knew the real fight was just beginning. The morning light filtered through the broken windows of Aunt Greta's study as Ingrid sat surrounded by the scattered remnants of her inheritance. Papers covered every surface, bank documents, photographs, letters written in her aunt's careful script. 3 days had passed since Klaus Meyer's arrest, but the weight of revelation still pressed against her chest like a physical thing. She picked up the leather journal one more time, running her fingers across the worn cover. Inside, Greta had documented everything: the Nazi gold stolen from concentration camps, the network of Swiss accounts, the web of corruption that stretched across 2 decades. But more than that, she had written about guilt, about the impossible choice between survival and conscience. "I took their money to save the lives they would have destroyed anyway," Greta had written. "But every franc burns in my hands. Every day I live with this fortune is another day I betray the dead." Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Ingrid looked up to see Detective Weber approaching, his face grim but not unkind. Behind him walked a woman in a tailored coat. Someone from the prosecutor's office, Ingrid assumed. "Miss Brenner," Weber said quietly, "we need to discuss what happens next." Ingrid closed the journal and stood, her back straight despite the exhaustion that had settled in her bones. "I assume you'll be seizing the accounts." The woman stepped forward. "Not all of them. Your aunt was thorough in her documentation. She clearly separated funds that came from legitimate sources, her work as a translator, investments made before the war. That money is rightfully yours, and the rest will be returned to its rightful owners where possible. The remainder will go to organizations dedicated to Holocaust survivors and their families." Ingrid nodded, relief washing over her. She had spent sleepless nights wondering if she would lose everything again, if the cycle of loss that had defined her life would continue. How much will remain?" Weber consulted his notes. "Enough to restore the estate, if that's what you choose. Enough for a new beginning." Through the window, Ingrid could see the village below. Smoke rose from chimneys, children played in the square, and life continued its eternal rhythm. For the first time since arriving at the estate, it felt like home rather than a burden. "There's something else," the prosecutor said, producing a manila envelope. "We found this in Klaus Meyer's safe. It's addressed to you." With trembling fingers, Ingrid opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small, tarnished key. The letter was brief, written in her aunt's hand. "My dearest Ingrid, if you are reading this, then the truth has finally come to light. The key opens a safety deposit box in Zurich, box 247 at Credit Suisse. Inside you will find something that belongs to our family, something I saved long before the war touched us. It is clean money, earned through honest work, and it is yours by right. I pray you will use it to build the life that war tried to steal from you. The past cannot be changed, but the future remains unwritten. Choose love over fear, hope over despair. You carry the best of our family within you. With all my love, Aunt Greta." Tears blurred Ingrid's vision. Even in death, even while bearing the weight of her terrible secret, Greta had tried to protect her. "We'll need you to come to Munich next week," Weber said. "Your testimony will be crucial for the trial. Meyer's associates won't give up easily." "I understand." Ingrid folded the letter carefully. "Detective Weber? The others who were involved, will they face justice? Some are already dead. Others have fled to countries without extradition treaties, but we'll pursue every lead your aunt's documents provide." He paused, studying her face. "Are you planning to stay here? In the village?" Ingrid looked around the study one more time. The bloodstains had been cleaned away, the broken furniture removed, but the memories remained. Yet alongside the darkness, she could feel something else taking root, a sense of purpose, of belonging. "Yes," she said firmly. "This is my home now. I'll restore the estate, but I'll also establish something new here. A foundation, perhaps. A place where people who have lost everything can find refuge." The prosecutor smiled. "Your aunt would have approved." After they left, Ingrid walked through the empty rooms of the estate. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like spirits in the air. She thought of her parents, of the family that had cast her out, of all the homes she had lost. But this was different. This was a home she would build herself, with clean hands and clear conscience. Outside, church bells began to ring, calling the village to Sunday service. Ingrid straightened her shoulders and walked toward the door. It was time to stop hiding from the world, time to step into the light and claim the future that was finally, truly hers. The nightmare was over. The healing could begin.